Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. We're diving into intriguing historical murder cases that have captured public attention over the years. Stay tuned as we uncover the details and enjoy the journey through history. The murder of Frederick Bryant. Charlotte Bryant was born in Londonderry, Northern Ireland, in 1904, her maiden name being McHugh. Little is known of her childhood, but by age 19 she was a nice-looking girl with raven black hair and attractive eyes who fraternized with the British soldiers in the province and was nicknamed Darky by them. She was illiterate, ill-educated, and notably promiscuous. Her activities were strongly disapproved of by the Republicans, and she was threatened with tarring and feathering, a fate that befell quite a few girls who went out with British soldiers during the Troubles. In 1922, she met Frederick Bryant, who was 8 years her senior. Frederick was serving as a military policeman in the Dorset Regiment. He had served in the army during the First World War and was described as a simple country lad. He immediately fell for Charlotte's physical charms. When Frederick's tour of duty ended, he returned to England and Charlotte went with him. They married a little while later at Wells in Somerset. Frederick resumed civilian life as a farm labourer and by 1925 was working as a cowman at a farm near Yeovil in the village of Overcompton. Like most small rural villages, there was little to do and even less excitement. Social life revolved round the local pub. In the 13 years of their marriage, Charlotte gave Frederick 5 children, although whether he was the father of all of them is open to question. Charlotte was very highly sexed and soon became bored with village life compared to the excitement of life around the Londonderry barracks, with plenty of attentive and free-spending soldiers and a good sex life. She didn't work as such and spent her days drinking and indulging in a little prostitution. One feels as much for the sex as for the money. She was known as Black Bess or Killarney Kate by the villagers and was thought of as a drunken slut. Surprisingly, Frederick seemed indifferent to these goings-on, to use an expression of the time. As he told a neighbour, "I don't care what she does. £4 a week is better than 30 shillings. £1.50 a week, which he earned as a cowman." In December 1933, Charlotte met Leonard Edward Parsons, a horse trader and gypsy, who took up lodgings in the Bryant's cottage and with whom she had an affair. In 1934, Frederick Bryant was sacked from his job as a farm labourer, as his employer was not happy about what was going on in his tied cottage. They then moved to the village of Coombe, near Sherborne, where again Frederick found employment as a farm labourer. The move did not change the domestic circumstances. Parsons simply moved with them, and his and Charlotte's affair continued unabated. Parsons did not live with the Bryants on a permanent basis, but rather stayed there between business trips. He had a common-law wife, Priscilla Loveridge, by whom he had fathered 4 children. Initially, Parsons and Frederick Bryant appeared to get on quite well and drank together in the local pub. Domestic life, however, was somewhat different, with Charlotte and Parsons sharing the marital bed, while Frederick had to sleep on the sofa on occasion. Eventually, Frederick could stand the situation no longer and ordered Parsons to leave. Charlotte went too, and she and Parsons rented rooms in Dorchester. She soon returned to the family home, however. A few days later, all 3 had a meeting, and Parsons was allowed back into the house. It appeared that Charlotte had become totally besotted with Parsons, but although he enjoyed her sexual favours, her love was not returned, and the relationship began to deteriorate. This was something, however, she was to deny at her trial. In May 1935, Frederick, who was then 39 years old, was taken ill for the first time, immediately after eating the lunch that Charlotte had cooked. He had severe stomach pains. Helped by a neighbour who induced vomiting, he began to feel a little easier. The doctor came to see him and diagnosed gastroenteritis, and after a few days Frederick Bryant returned to work. A further attack followed in August, and again Frederick made a full recovery. In November 1935, Parsons dropped a huge bombshell into Charlotte's life by announcing that he was leaving. His stated reason was the lack of work in that part of Dorset, although the deterioration in Charlotte's looks may have had far more to do with it. On December the 11th, 1935, Frederick was again taken ill with severe stomach pains, from which, once more, he recovered. Charlotte continued to search for Parsons in the local pubs, but without success. She did, however, form a new relationship with a woman called Lucy Osler, who was a widow with 7 children. Lucy moved into the Bryants' home and witnessed Frederick's final attack on the night of December the 22nd, 1935. He once again suffered extremely severe stomach pains. This time it was so bad that he was admitted to hospital in Sherborne, where he died in the afternoon of the 23rd. His death was regarded as suspicious by the doctors, and therefore a post-mortem was carried out. Analysis of his tissues by Home Office pathologist Dr. Roche Lynch found 4.09 grains of arsenic in the body. These findings were reported to Dorset Constabulary, who visited Charlotte and removed her and the children to a workhouse in Sturminster Newton while they conducted a minute search of the Bryants' cottage and garden. Of the 150-odd samples sent to the Home Office laboratory, 32 contained arsenic. Among the items recovered was a burnt tin which had contained an arsenic-based weed killer. Armed with this vital piece of information, the police systematically visited all the local chemist shops to try and establish where the weed killer had been purchased and by whom. Their efforts bore fruit, and they discovered a Yeovil chemist who had sold a tin of the weed killer to a woman who only signed the poisons register with an X. Remember, Charlotte could not write, a fact known to all who knew her. The chemist, however, was unable to identify either Charlotte or Lucy Ostler in a subsequent identity parade. On February the 10th, 1936, Charlotte, who was still at the workhouse in Sturminster Newton, was arrested and charged with the murder of her husband. She is reported to have told the officers that arrested her, "I haven't got poison from anywhere and that people know. I don't see how they can say I poisoned my husband." The trial opened on Wednesday, May the 27th, 1936, the Dorset Assizes in Dorchester, before Mr. Justice Mackinnon. It was to last just 4 days, which was by no means unusual in capital murder trials in those days. As it was a high-profile poisoning case, the prosecution case was led by the Solicitor General, Sir Terence O'Connor. Charlotte was defended by the well-known barrister, Mr. J.D. Caswell, K.C., The prosecution argued that the case was a classic eternal triangle and that Charlotte poisoned her husband to be able to have Parsons. They could not show direct evidence that Charlotte either bought or administered the arsenic, although the circumstantial evidence supported this theory. Lucy Ostler testified against Charlotte and told the court that on the night Frederick died, Charlotte had made him an OXO drink and that he was violently sick after taking it. She also related how she had explained to Charlotte what an inquest was and alleged that Charlotte had told her that she hated Frederick and only stayed with him because of the children. She told the court about the tin of weed killer and how Charlotte had said that she would have to get rid of it. She mentioned how she had found the remains of burnt clothing in the boiler and had then discovered the remains of the tin amongst the ashes, which she had thrown into the yard where the police discovered it. The burnt remains of the tin are pictured right. Mr. Caswell was unable to shake Lucy Ostler, who stuck to her damning allegations against Charlotte. Leonard Parsons' testimony did not help her case either. He told the court how they had intercourse on numerous occasions. Nowadays, this may not seem shocking, but in 1936, promiscuity and adultery were considered totally unacceptable and had the effect of painting Charlotte as a scarlet woman, something that probably bore considerable weight with the jury. Forensic evidence was presented by Dr. Roche Lynch, who had analysed the various samples taken from the Bryants' home. He demonstrated to the court how arsenic could be dissolved in OXO and not be spotted by a person drinking it. He also told the court that he had found that the ashes from the boiler in which Charlotte was alleged to have tried to destroy the weed killer tin contained 149 parts per million of arsenic, whereas ashes normally contained around 45 parts per million. Altogether, 30 witnesses had testified for the prosecution and painted a dire picture of the woman in the dock. Mr. Caswell called Charlotte as a witness with some trepidation, but in fact she did much better than he expected. She denied knowing about poison or possessing any weed killer. She also demonstrated to the court that an old coat in which traces of arsenic had been found, and which it was alleged that she had worn when she bought the weed killer, did not fit her at all. Interestingly, she told the court that she was pleased when Parsons left their house, and that she had lost interest in him, rather than the other way round. Charlotte's older children gave evidence next, but their testimony was in fact very damaging to their mother's case. They related how she had asked Ernest, her older son, to dispose of some blue bottles in late December. Her daughter Lily told how she had seen Parsons with a blue bottle whose contents had fizzed when poured onto a stone by Parsons in front of Charlotte. Once all the evidence had been heard, and the closing statements made by both sides, Mr. Justice Mackinnon commenced the summing up. He asked the jury to consider two principal questions. Was Frederick Bryant poisoned with arsenic, and if so, was that arsenic administered by Charlotte? He noted that Charlotte had been present on each occasion her husband had been ill, and that two of the bouts of sickness had occurred before Lucy Ostler, a possible suspect, had come into the household. On Saturday the 30th, the jury, after deliberating for just an hour, returned a verdict of guilty against Charlotte. When asked if she had anything to say before sentence was passed, she replied in a calm voice, "I am not guilty." Mr. Justice Mackinnon had the black cap placed upon his wig and then passed the only sentence the law permitted in 1936. He sentenced her to be taken hence to the prison in which she had been last confined, and from there to a place of execution where she was to be hanged by her neck until she was dead, her body to be buried in the precincts of the prison in which she was last confined, to which he added the customary rider, "And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul." There was considerable emotion in the court, and Mr. Justice Mackinnon seemed to have difficulty saying these dread words to her. On hearing her sentence, Charlotte broke down and was led sobbing from the dock. After the trial, Mr. Caswell received a letter from a Professor Bone who had read about the case in his Sunday paper. He told Mr. Caswell that far from 149 parts per million of arsenic that Dr. Roche had found in the ashes was on the low side for ashes, and certainly not an unusually high amount, as Dr. Roche had told the court. Professor Bone later provided the defense with a signed statement to this effect. Charlotte's appeal was heard on the 29th of June at the Appeal Court in London. Amazingly, the appeal court refused to hear the evidence of Professor Bone and concluded that even if the jury had been correctly advised by Dr. Roche, that the outcome of the trial would have been the same. Thus, her appeal was denied, and her sentence stood. At this time, it would have been unprecedented for the Court of Appeal to admit new evidence. It just concerned itself with the conduct of the trial. However, one could argue that Professor Bone's statement was not new evidence, but rather a correction of flawed evidence that had already been given at the original trial by the prosecution's expert witness. Charlotte spent almost 6 weeks in the condemned cell, where her once raven hair had turned completely white, presumably due to the stress of her situation. She decided, after much agonizing, against seeing her children as she felt it would be too much for them to bear. She was visited regularly by Father Barney, a Catholic priest, who prayed with her and had a small altar set up in her cell. She began to learn to read and write with the help of the shifts of female warders who looked after her round the clock, and was able to dictate a telegram to the king asking for clemency. She also wrote a letter in which she said, "It is all fault. I'm here. I listened to the tales I was told, but I have not got long now, and I will be out of my troubles. God bless my children." The Home Office obliterated the name in this note, so we will never know whose fault Charlotte thought it was. A lot had been going on behind the scenes to try and save Charlotte. Sir Stafford Cripps, at that time a Member of Parliament, had applied to the Home Secretary to declare a mistrial and order a new one on the grounds of the flawed evidence. Questions had also been raised in the House of Parliament about the case, and the usual petitions got up. There appeared to be an unwritten rule at the Home Office that poisoners should not be reprieved, and this practice was followed in Charlotte's case. Strangely, Charlotte was neither confined or hanged at Dorchester Prison. in the county in which she was convicted and sentenced, although it continued to have an execution chamber which was last used for the hanging of David Jennings in July 1941. Instead, she was sent to Exeter Jail in neighbouring Devon to await execution. Although nobody was executed at Dorchester during this time, the condemned cell may have been in use for a prisoner who was subsequently reprieved. Charlotte was led to the gallows at 8 a.m. on Wednesday, July the 15th, 1936, by Tom Pierrepoint, assisted by Thomas Phillips. Albert Pierrepoint may also have assisted his uncle at this execution. By an odd coincidence, a man called George Bryant, no relation, had been hanged the previous day at Wandsworth. As was the norm by 1936, Charlotte's execution was an entirely secret affair, and there were no reporters present. However, she was attended by a Catholic priest, Father Barney, who was not bound by Home Office rules of secrecy. He later described her last moments as truly edifying. She met her end with Christian fortitude. He reported, however, that she never confessed to the murder. In accordance with her sentence, after autopsy, her body was buried in the grounds of the prison, probably at lunchtime that same day. Charlotte left the tiny sum of 5 shillings and 8 pence halfpenny to be her children, who, being now orphaned, were taken into the care of Dorset County Council. 2. Anders Lindbeck, the Swedish priest poisoner. Lindbeck was born in Bredtvet, near Brolanda, on 22 December 1803, to the farmer Sven Andersson and his mother Lisa Olsdotter. The family was extremely poor, and Sven was at times forced to steal to feed his family. His father received the derogatory moniker of Ham Sven, for supposedly being caught stealing a ham at one point. While growing up, Anders received many taunts and jeers from the people around him due to the crimes of his father. The family made ends meet mostly through gifts of food from around the parish community until his maternal uncle, Vicar Johan Nordahl, sponsored Lindbeck with enough money to attend school in Vänersborg. Later on, in 1824, he attended one of Sweden's oldest upper secondary schools, the Cathedral School in Skara. Lindbeck was enrolled at Uppsala University on the 2nd of February 1829 and was later ordained there on the 19th of December 1831. Immediately after his graduation, he was hired by the Church of Sweden as a curate for the parish at Skalerud and simultaneously acted as headmaster at the local school, which was funded by the nearby ironworks. He stayed there until 1861, when he applied for and was given the role of vicar for the parish in Silberdal. During his stay in Skalerud, Lindbeck had been a fierce opponent of alcoholism and preached for temperance and complete abstinence from alcohol, a battle he continued when he moved to Silberdal. While living in Skalerud, Lindbeck received board and lodging from a local farmer and inspector Johan Ågren, whose unmarried niece Johanna Ågren quickly became enamored with Lindbeck. Even so, he decided to marry another woman by the name of Fredrika Charlotta Bergman in 1834. However, after the death of her uncle, Johanna Ågren offered to sell her uncle's farm for a far smaller sum than expected on the condition that she could live on the farm for the remainder of her days. It was a wealthy farmstead, and the profits made from it gave Lindbeck the opportunity to give both his sons a proper education, both becoming officers in the Swedish army. After accepting the position as vicar in the parish of Silberdal, Lindbeck was given the unenviable task of caring for a group of 40 people who were supposed to receive poverty aid from the church. A very heavy burden to bear for such a small parish connected to a woodland township. Lindbeck sought to relieve the pressure these expenses were putting on his parish, and thus began to push through a number of regulations and ordinances in an effort to lower these costs. He wanted to minimize as much of the costs that the church was bearing as possible. Establishing an advisory board of 9 people, and together with them he set strict rules. One of their decisions was that only their own parishioners could receive help from the church. In general, these new regulations, which stated who could receive aid and who was to be denied, became more stringent as time went on, and some of them might even have been illegal. This turned into a near obsessive compulsion to the point that he committed at least 3 documented murders by mixing arsenic with the communion wine. There were also suspicions that he had poisoned others and simply failed to kill his victims in quite a few of these poisonings, instead leading to bouts of extreme sickness, but not resulting in the death of the victim. As Lindbeck tried to find ways to cut costs for the parish, he saw the poor and sick as too much of a drain on the church coffers. Thus, he came up with an economically beneficial solution that would also decrease the number of supplicants, by poisoning them as they received their Holy Communion. In the latter half of 1864, he made several home visits to people to deliver food and his blessings as the local vicar to those who were sick. However, after some of his visits, the people he visited would end up getting worse than they were before. Then, on the 19th of October that year, a widow by the name of Karin Persdotter was the first to be killed by the spiked wine and wafers. A little over a month later, on 30th of November 1864, a farmer named Niels Pettersson was the second person to die after a visit by Lindbeck, followed by Anders Lysen on 15th December 1864. Furthermore, 4 others are known to have been poisoned severely enough that they suffered serious symptoms. Lindbeck's last victim, Anders Lysen, had indeed been of poor health when he was visited by the vicar. However, he wasn't poor, nor was he without friends or family. His sudden death led to his relatives suspecting foul play. In February of 1865, Lysen's relatives demanded that his grave be opened and an autopsy conducted on his corpse. This was promptly done, and a month later, in March, it was concluded that Lysen had indeed died from being poisoned with arsenic. Suspicion quickly landed on Lindbeck, as he had been one of the last people to be in close proximity to Lysen before his death, and it was also discovered that several burials at the local church had been conducted unusually fast. Lindbeck was arrested and brought to stand trial at the Nordmark District Court, where he confessed to his crimes, but attempted to defend his actions by saying they were intended as an act of mercy. However, the court found that at least one of the murders had been committed with some degree of financial motivation, and thus rejected his explanation outright and condemned him to death by beheading. The case was later brought before the Court of Appeal, which scolded the district court for a substandard investigation and legal process. Thus, the case was sent back to the district court, which upheld their previous verdict. While Lindbeck was awaiting execution in Karlstad prison, he committed suicide by hanging.